Welcome to the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio, and I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. Honor and fidelity is the motto of the 65th Infantry Regiment, also known as the Borinqueneers, the only Puerto Rican unit in the United States Army. Tonight, in honor of National Hispanic Heritage Month, Connecticut author Talia Aikens-Nuñez will share the 65th story, one of forgotten sagas of the Korean War, and the challenges they faced leading up to the largest court-martial in the war in men of the 65th, the Borinqueneers of the Korean War. Since the regiment's creation in 1899, the men of the 65th have proudly served the U.S. through multiple wars, despite facing racial discrimination. The Borinqueneers fought in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. Due to segregation, Aikens-Nuñez says it was not until the Korean War that they were able to demonstrate their determination, bravery, and courage. She will base her lecture on her book of the same title, underscoring the courageousness of the men of the 65th and the soldiers' firsthand accounts of the Korean War. The commander of the United Nations Forces, General MacArthur, visited the unit on the Korean battlefield and praised their brilliant record of achievement in battle. But the honor and fidelity of the men of the 65th came into question in 1952 when 91 of them were arrested and tried for desertion and disobeying orders. Years later, the convictions were overturned for the Borinqueneers and they were given honorable discharges. Talia Aikens-Nuñez was born in New York City and attended Wellesley College and New York University. She's the author of several children's books, including Small Nap, Little Dream, Escucha Means Listen, and a series of chapter books called OMG. Currently, she is working on a screenplay adapted from Men of the 65th, the Borinqueneers of the Korean War. Welcome, Talia.
Thank you, everyone. Oops. So Operation Thunderbolt kicked off at the height of the Korean War. This was January 25th, 1951. Launched as a counteroffensive to check the Chinese advance south, which now threatened Seoul, it involved UN forces from the United States, Great Britain, South Korea, and Turkey. In the opening phases of Thunderbolt, one of the American regiments involved, the United States Army's 65th Infantry Regiment, was ordered to push north toward South Korea, the South Korean capital. Over the next several days, the men of the 65th seized hills that were held by the Chinese, in the process carrying out the last battalion-sized bayonet charge in United States Army history. Of course, that's not the only thing that sets the 65th apart in the annals of American history. The unit, dubbed the Borinqueneers, is the only Latino segregated regiment in U.S. military history. Here we go. The 65th has a unique place in military history. For starters, since the regiment's creation in 1899, the unit was naturally desegregated. It was comprised of Puerto Rican soldiers who were both white and black, even though the United States military wouldn't fully desegregate for another 49 years. The unit would go on to serve with the American Expeditionary Forces in the First World War. However, due to segregation policies at the time, they were primarily relegated to support roles. During the Second World War, the 65th would initially be assigned to protect the Panama Canal Zone before being deployed to North Africa, where they also would see no combat. In late 1944, they were moved to southern France, where, aside from a few small firefights, they saw little action, being largely relegated to rear echelon security roles. Ironically, the 65th Infantry Regiment made its first splash in peacetime. In late winter, early spring 1950, the Borinqueneers surprised the military brass with their combat readiness during a military exercise called Operation Port Rex, which stood for Puerto Rico Exercise. The war game involved hypothetical American invasion of a Caribbean nation, the island of Vieques, which is about 5 miles off of Puerto Rico, would be the site of this exercise. The tiny island is only 52 square miles. It's about 21 miles long and about 2 or 3 miles wide. To give a little background, the military purchased about 60% of the island in 1941 from just 2 owners. As I explain in the book, in the 1940s, large, lush, green sugar plantations covered most of Vieques, and most of the people that lived there were poor laborers who lived and worked on the plantations. These laborers did not own the land, so when the United States purchased the land, it essentially evicted those laborers, forcing them off of the land. And on that land, the United States military did military exercises and bomb testing, to name a few of their activities there. So for Operation Port Rex, the script assigned the 65th the role of hostile local forces. They were called the aggressors. The aggressors had to pretend that they captured the island and were to defend it from the liberators. The liberators were some of the most decorated men who fought in World War II. Further, the liberators outnumbered the aggressors 4-1. It was not meant to be a fair fight, but rather a military exercise to teach and practice joint operations between the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force, which was very important about a year and a half later. Not only did the men of the 65th successfully capture the Marine reconnaissance units inserted into the island and advance the landing, but they also captured many of the airborne troops that parachuted into the island. What's more, soldiers of the 65th managed to infiltrate the ranks of the liberators to sow confusion and collect intelligence. They created such strong fortifications along the beaches that they stalled the liberators' amphibious landing. They used their natural resources and creativity at every point. For example, they knew that the Caribbean trade winds would blow potential paratroopers in a certain direction. So they set up traps that they estimated where the paratroopers would land. Further, they estimated that the Navy would approach the island from either Red Beach or Blue Beach because they were the only ones that were able to accommodate a regimental combat team. So they knew the defenses on the beaches had to be secure and robust. Along the beaches were palm trees, like many Caribbean islands. The men cut 80% of the trunk of the palm tree so it would fall in like a right triangle. So this is the trunk. So they wouldn't go all the way through. They went partially through so it fell like this. And then they wrapped it in barbed wire, creating a fence-like structure across all of the beaches there. One of my favorite stories about Operation Port Rex centered around a soldier dressed as a simple farmer. Carrying a briefcase in his hand, he went to the Liberators' command post. Inside were the commanders of all of the military units preparing their operations. The farmer knocked, and when the door was open, the farmer politely saluted the men, handed them the briefcase, saying, "Here's something for you," as if he was delivering a gift. They took the briefcase as the farmer quickly disappeared. They opened the briefcase, and in there was a note saying, "This is a booby trap. You are all now dead." The fake bomb killed everyone within 100 yards. Since this was an exercise, the umpires restored them to life, and the exercise proceeded. This story is an illustration of their planning and the breadth of their strategy. Port Rex shocked the Pentagon and showed that the Puerto Rican regiment was fit for frontline combat roles. It would not be long before they were called upon for real. 6 months later, America would find itself at war with Korea. Let me backtrack a little and give you a better understanding of the pride within the unit, as well as the understanding of who sailed from Puerto Rico to South Korea in the summer of 1950. A few months after Operation Port Rex, the commanders of the 65th were invited to a secret teleconference. The commander of the unit was, at the time, a veteran and West Point graduate, Colonel W.W. Harris. When Harris was initially assigned to the unit, he thought he was being punished because he was assigned to the, quote, rum and Coca-Cola outfit. However, his opinion of the men quickly changed. So I'm going to read an excerpt in my book to give you an idea of what teleconferencing was like at that time. There was no video conferencing at the time. Instead, in the room stood a big white movie theater screen on which outgoing and incoming messages appeared in text. Seated next to the screen was the typist who operated the teleconferencing equipment. Silbert, who was Harris's superior, walked into the room right before the teleconference began. Anxiously waiting for the text messages to appear on the screen, Silbert, in a foreshadowing moment, turned to Harris. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about a reason for this conference, and the only logical conclusion that I can reach is that the 65th is headed for Korea." They soon had their answers. The names of the people on the conference appeared on the screen, and then their orders appeared. "You are directed to prepare the 65th Infantry Regiment for an overseas assignment. Destination unknown, secret. The plan is for the 65th to move to an unknown destination overseas, there to join up with the 3rd United States Infantry Division and go through a cycle of basic training before onward movement to your final destination, secret. You will be prepared to sail within 10 days' time." The teleconference continued and allowed Colonel Harris to ask questions. And I'm going to read for you his second question. Question. Request authorization to recruit personnel with at least 6 months PS previous service to bring the regiment to full strength plus 10% overstrength. End of question. Secret. Silence again as Harris waited for the answer, and the response came. Approved. Harris breathed a sigh of relief. The teleconference ended. It was time to execute the orders. The 65th Infantry Regiment was heading overseas. The affirmative answer to Harris's second question meant that the 65th was approved to have almost 4,000 troops. At the time, the regiment only had 92 officers and 1,895 enlisted soldiers. Harris moved quickly to increase enlistment. Radio broadcasters publicized the open recruitment into the 65th throughout Puerto Rico. By the next morning, droves of men reported to the fort. The island had always been famous for its amazing patriotism, sporting some of the highest volunteer enlistment numbers of any state or territory in the United States. In August 1950, that patriotism was on full display. Hundreds lined up and down the streets and around the corners. Just a handful of days later, in August, the men boarded a ship to an unknown destination. During their sail, the man came up with their battle name. They chose Borinqueneers, which is a portmanteau. So it's a combination of two words. Like podcast is a combination of iPod and broadcast, or malware is a combination of malicious and software. So Borinquen is Taíno for Puerto Rico. The Taíno people were the original inhabitants of Puerto Rico when Columbus landed there in 1493. The second word is buccaneer, who were Spanish pirates who sailed the Caribbean. Combining the two words spoke to the men's heritage and ancestry as well as their fighting spirit. Oh, actually, so some of these pictures are actually from my trip to Vieques, because I wanted to get just a personal feel of what the island and where the men were in this exercise. So on the bottom is Red Beach. That's where the liberators approached from. And then the picture in the middle is actually from the New York Times. So as the trade winds came, the paratroopers were blown, so the Times got a picture of that. The unit landed in Pusan in September 1950. Many of the men never left Puerto Rico before. So let me paint a picture for you. They land and they see these small adobe huts that dot the landscape, the little straw-covered houses with clay chimneys and rice paddies all around. They see the Korean people who are riding their bikes down dirt roads, pedaling hard with their thin rubber moccasins, as well as hundreds of refugees fleeing south to escape the war. But, as good soldiers do, they landed and went right to work. They began advancing with UN forces up the Korean peninsula, taking many North Korean POWs along the way and gaining territory for the United Nations Command Forces, the UNC forces. I want to briefly tell you about one fight that they had in early November. At the time, the 65th was attached to X-Corps. The leader of X-Corps was Major General Edward Almond. The orders for this mission were given in person directly from General Almond to Colonel Harris. They knew that they were outnumbered, and they knew they were going to join up with the 1st Cavalry Division. However, they were not exactly sure where the 1st Cavalry Position's exact location was. They knew they were somewhere west of Yongbyon, North Korea, While at export headquarters, Colonel Harris came upon a radio truck with its operators who were sitting under a tree. I'm going to read for you an excerpt from Harris's memoir, Puerto Rico's Fighting 65th, U.S. Infantry from San Juan to Chirwan, just to give you an idea of how this interaction went, and to give you a feel of Harris. Good morning, sir, from all three men. I'm Colonel Harris, the regimental commander of the Puerto Rican outfit, the 65th. Oh, we've heard of that outfit, sir, one of them said. Yes, sir, we sure have, said another. They must be some fighters, said the third. We hear most of the radio conversations all over Korea, and we've heard about your men. That was interesting, I thought. What are you men doing? Nothing, sir, just waiting for someone to tell us what to do. You mean you don't have a job? No, sir. How would you like to go with us? Great, sir. We've been waiting for someone to give us something to do. Where are you headed? Well, General Alman just gave us the mission of going to a place called Yonghung. From there, we are headed out west and make contact with the enemy coming down from the north. What Harris is referencing is that the Chinese entered the war on the side of the North Koreans. On their way to Yonghung, driving in their line of 2.5-ton trucks, they were attacked by forces but continued to push the enemy back. They arrived in Yonghung, settled in for the night, and went to bed. They were woken up by gunfire. Now I'm going to read for you that exchange. The next attack came on November 7th at 3:30 in the morning with the familiar hiss of incoming mortars. The men awoke to dirt flying and dust everywhere. The whistles of incoming rifle fire accompanied the mortars. The men quickly shimmied out of their sleeping bags and sprang into action. The firepower initially came from the west, but was quickly joined by shots from all sides. The shadows of enemy soldiers flickered in the darkness. Some 3,000 men had descended upon them. The Borinqueneers returned machine gun fire. Typically, they would fire mortars back at the enemy, but the regimental mortar company had not been sent with the 2nd Battalion. As the men continued exchanging fire for an hour and a half, Harris began to worry that they would run out of ammunition. If the fighting continued at that pace, they would deplete their supply within hours. Thinking fast, he remembered the radio truck and used it to send an urgent priority message to Alman. From Harris to Alman, the message read, quote, under attack by enemy force estimated at 2 regiments. Estimate 2nd Battalion will be out of ammunition by 8 o'clock in the morning. Request emergency airdrop of basic load rifle ammunition, comma, medical supplies, comma, and sea rations, period, signed Harris, end quote. They could do nothing but wait. Time crept by as the heavy fighting continued. The sun peeked over the horizon. Just as the light touched the battlefield, Harris heard whoop, 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 the approach of incoming aircraft. 7 C-47s, huge military aircrafts designed for transporting troops and cargo, flew overhead. They dropped several loads of cargo attached to parachutes that floated towards the struggling soldiers through the smoke and dust of battle. The loads landed nearby on the mountaintop. The men retrieved the ammunition, medical supplies, and sea rations that Harris had requested. The men roared and cheered, screaming, Mana del Cielo, pennies from heaven. As you can see from that example and the request to go overseas over strength, Harris's wartime experience and a little luck paid off in different situations. They were well-trained and a well-led unit under him. Those things that he could control made them a better unit. Another example is when Harris was first assigned to the unit. When he arrived in Puerto Rico, there was a court-martial order for any soldier that spoke Spanish. Harris lifted the ban. Not only on the battlefield in Korea did he see Spanish as an asset, but he also knew that small gesture would endear him with the soldiers, which it did. Some of the things he could not control hurt the unit, but they persevered. For example, they sailed from Puerto Rico in their summer uniforms, and they quickly progressed up the Korean peninsula. So by November, they were in North Korea. They were met with snow and temperatures that were below zero. Many of the men suffered from frostbite, but some of the men created heating devices out of their equipment, wrapped themselves in towels, layered socks on their hands, and they made do. Winter uniforms did not reach the unit until late November, and the whole unit did not have them until December. Just going to pause for a second. I sat down with a person who recently passed away, Celestino Cordova, who was a Borinqueneer, and God bless him, he let me talk to him for 5 hours about his time in Korea and his time in the military. And I wish I videoed him and how he explained how they kept warm. They jumped up and down, they did push-ups, they would do relays essentially. But I just wanted to take a moment just to say, Celestino, and if you buy or read the book, you'll see Celestino's in the book as well. But the test of frigid temperatures would not be the hardest test that they faced at that time. In the first few days of December, they received several contradictory orders. They knew something was going on and it was not good. By the time they received their third and final order, they knew. They were to travel north to Hamhung to protect the withdrawal of the 1st Marine Division, who was surrounded by the enemy by the Chosin Reservoir. This is frequently referred to as the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. They created a plan which required a protected withdrawal of the division and that a route be kept cleared all the way to the port in Hungnam. Men were stationed in front of the division, clearing the way to the port, behind them, protecting their rear, on the sides, and on high ridges above, keeping the area cleared. It was a several-mile-long evacuation route. They got the Marines to the port, they loaded on a ship, and sailed south back to South Korea. Then some supplies shipped out. Then the refugees and the 7th Infantry Division boarded ships back to South Korea. I'm now going to read an excerpt from my book about the end of this mission around Christmas 1950. The night of December 22nd was cold, with snow covering the ground and stars glittering like shards of ice. The Borinqueneers were stationed on a snowy hill just outside of Hungnam, still protecting the harbor. As they had for the past several days, at the darkest point of the night, PVA forces struck against the Borinqueneers. But this night was different. The enemy soldiers were much more numerous than expected. About 2,000 PVA soldiers emerged from the dark and attacked the battalion on the hill. Crystals of ice and snow flew into the air. The flashes and smoke of gunfire lit the night. This bloody battle was one of their last in Hungnam. With the other troops withdrawn, it was time for the 3rd Division to begin loading onto boats. The main line of resistance fell back to the perimeter of the harbor. They were exhausted from several days of fighting, no longer smiling yet still determined. They finally would board ships in their dirty and tattered uniforms. On the afternoon of December 24th, the 65th began loading onto 4 ships. The soldiers of the 65th were some of the last to leave Hungnam. They were hurried and squeezed tightly onto the final boats. Finally, they could rest and relax. Once they left, the military would destroy the port so the enemy could not use the equipment and facilities against them. Years later, retired soldier Rivera Santiago remembered that Christmas Eve. These are his words. "We finally left, everybody leaving, and we were still on top of the hill making guard, protecting the folks so everyone could get out. And we could see them, PVA forces, on some of the hills about 2 miles away approaching. On that day, they called us and they told us to come down to the port and leave everything behind except your weapons and whatever ammunition you have left. Destroy whatever you can. We got to the port, and there were a lot of railroad cars and vehicles loaded with ammunition, food, gasoline, all kinds of supplies, and they had dynamite charges already set in place, and they told us to be careful not to trip over them. After they loaded onto the final ship and they set sail, the dynamite detonated. The soldiers looked back and watched the port explode. The buildings, the vehicles, the train cars, everything erupted in smoke and flame." And that's that picture in the bottom corner there. They arrived back in Busan on New Year's Day, 1951. By January 5th, they were back on the front lines, pushing north. They had a real reputation at this point for being fierce fighters. Commander of the 8th Army, General Ridgway, stayed with Colonel Harris and observed the unit for a couple of days, and they received a brief visit from General Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur asked Colonel Harris, quote, "Are your troops still doing the same fine job they have been?" End quote. Later he said, of the unit, quote, "The Puerto Ricans forming the ranks of the gallant 65th Infantry give daily proof on the battlefields of Korea of their courage, determination, and resolute will to victory, their invincible loyalty to the United States, and their fervent devotion to those immutable principles of human relations which the Americans of the continent and Puerto Rico have in common. They are writing a brilliant record of heroism in battle." By spring, the United States and its allies had liberated Seoul for the third and final time in the Korean War. As the war progressed, veterans from the 65th were rotated back to the United States. The military learned during World War II that being in battle too long caused fatigue. The goal was to rotate out commanders and soldiers before they would succumb to what commanders referred to as battle exhaustion. Green replacements filled the ranks. Many of these fresh troops spoke only English, while the officers were English-only speaking from the mainland United States. Unit cohesion suffered. By the summer of 1951, all of the commanders who sailed from Puerto Rico to Korea rotated back to the United States, as well as the majority of the men that filled the ranks with previous war experience who were also bilingual. Further, soldiers were not being replaced equally to fill the ranks of the overstrength unit that sailed from Puerto Rico. The unit lost 1/3 of its approved strengths from rotation alone. It was around this time that President Truman wanted to negotiate peace talks. General MacArthur did not, so Truman replaced him. Politically, the war was very unpopular, and Truman's opponent, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was criticizing Truman's handling of the war. As peace talks were taking place, the new commanders of the military ordered military units to hold their positions and the mainline resistance. So, as the enemy would rain down heavy fire on them, they could return fire, but they couldn't advance. As military historian Gilberto Villahermosa explains in his book, Honor and Fidelity, during the first 6 months of 1952, the 65th Infantry lost a total of 5,297 soldiers, either casualties or rotations, and gained 3,825 new soldiers. The number of new soldiers to the unit was nearly the same as that of the men that originally sailed from Puerto Rico in 1950. In February 1952, the 65th gained a new commander, Colonel Juan Cordero Davila, a veteran from the Puerto Rico National Guard. He was a veteran of World War II with extensive administrative and staffing experience, but he lacked the battlefield experience and former military training like Colonel Harris had. Despite Colonel Davila's extensive training plans, the intense rotation schedule made it difficult to build train capacity in the regiment. It was the fall of 1952 that these problems came to a head. The unit was defending Outpost Kelly. That's a ridge near the 38th parallel. I'm going to read a section from my book that explains the crushing defeat that the men endured. Outpost Kelly had sleeping bunkers, a small command bunker, an outer circle of automatic weapons bunkers, and a circular trench on top of the hill. Around 9:30 at night, the officers inside the command bunkers were planning their next moves when they heard small arms gunfire outside. This was not unusual so close to the front lines, and they continued with their briefing. Suddenly, the small wooden door flung open and multiple grenades smacked on the floor. One commander was close enough to the door to make it past the threshold when the grenades exploded, catapulting him through the air. He landed on the ground right in front of a group of Chinese soldiers with machine guns. He immediately leapt to his feet, ignoring the pain blazing from his wounded leg, and fled down the hill. Less than an hour later, Chinese forces controlled Outpost Kelly. They had killed or captured many of the soldiers on the hill. The rest of the 65th, who were holding the main line of resistance below the hill, could see from below their fellow soldiers who were captured. Assessments revealed that 40% of B Company had been killed, was wounded, or was missing because of the surprise attack. Shocked by the surprise attack, Cordero Davila knew he had to think carefully about his response. To the surprise of many of his men, he did not immediately order them to recapture the hill. As First Lieutenant Duke Wolfe later wrote, quote, "There was a reluctance on the part of the regiment and division to begin shelling the enemy for fear of our own troops," end quote. While they waited, the Chinese forces fortified their positions by adding more firepower to the hill in case UNC forces tried to take it back. Finally, Cordero Davila decided Outpost Kelly could not be left in enemy hands. Over the next few days, his men tried over and over again to retake the hill, but over and over again they failed. They tried to send smaller groups of soldiers to determine the strength of the Chinese groups. Within 3 hours, that group was dragging their wounded soldiers back to their original locations. They determined that about 100 soldiers had the hill. They requested airstrikes, but were denied out of fear for the wounded UNC soldiers laying on the hill. Just before midnight on September 21st, they tried again, but the barrage of enemy fire stopped them. They made another attempt just before 5 that morning. The heavy enemy fire stopped them again. The sieges were bloody and violent. Grenades and gunfire destroyed what remained of the natural ground cover and left many of the soldiers dead. A former soldier recalled, quote, "It looked as if there had never been any vegetation there. That's how the hill looked. There were pieces of legs and shoes. It was a very traumatic experience." The defeat shook the wider U.S. Army. The brass relieved the regiment's commander, Colonel Davila, and replaced him with Colonel Chester de Gavra, a Spanish-speaking officer from the mainland United States. Colonel de Gavra had experience with the unit serving as one of the lower-ranking commanders between 1937 and 1939. He noticed things were different in the unit at this point than he remembered in the 1930s. After the defeat at Outpost Kelly, the men seemed jumpy and nervous. They would fire into darkness and lob grenades at every sound. Also, the language divide was growing larger in the unit as new Spanish-only speaking recruits joined the unit and bilingual veterans rotated back home. De Gavra assessed that the unit needed more discipline, which he believed would bring more stability to the unit, thus enhancing soldier morale. So, he ordered all men to cut their hair, mustaches, and beards until, or quote, until such time as they gave proof of their manhood, end quote. For the Puerto Rican soldiers, placing doubt in their manhood was an ultimate insult. The new commanding officer, Colonel de Gavra, also stripped the regiment of its battle name, Borinqueneers, and ended the special sea rations, which were a Puerto Rican dish of rice and beans. That was something established by Colonel Harris. This harsh identity-attacking response further lowered morale after the crushing defeat at Outpost Kelly. While demoralized by the defeat and the punitive measures brought in by their new commander, morale of the 65th was further eroded. While defending Hill 391, later referred to as Jackson Heights, the 65th came under heavy bombardment. Deployed in such a forward position, fresh supplies had trouble reaching them. Jackson Heights was about 2,000 yards north of the main line of resistance, essentially in Chinese-held territory. In other words, it was under constant surveillance by the Chinese, so air support was not possible. Also, the hill was made of impenetrable rock, making it virtually impossible. They could not build defensive emplacements. And at that time, that was one of the main ways that the U.S. Army was able to take positions in advance, was by building those emplacements. They sustained days of heavy enemy fire. I'm going to read an excerpt from my book about this time in late October 1952. On October 25th at 11 in the morning, the Chinese soldiers began firing incessantly at Hill 391 from a nearby ridge, continuing all day and into the night. G Company took over and fired some flares back to keep the enemy from charging the hill. But late that night, the Chinese forces began to flank the outposts from the east and west. G Company stood strong and pushed them back, but sustained many casualties. The 65th held their position after repeated assaults through the following day. On the morning of October 27th, the enemy tried again, firing rounds from every direction, as described by one of their lower-level commanders, Colonel Batances Ramirez. They destroyed 75% of G Company's ammunition supply, and by the afternoon, at least a dozen men were injured and several lay dead from the relentless shelling. The remaining men fired round after round and mortar after mortar, but the number of casualties skyrocketed. By evening, Batances Ramirez ordered the men to withdraw. Quote, "It was horrible. There were rounds landing 3 and 4 at a time. It was everywhere, he later recalled. So they created a new plan. 2 companies, A and F, were going to retake the hill. But after suffering the loss of their commander, the soldiers of A Company retreated from Jackson Heights. Some men were bringing dead or wounded soldiers back, and others were running from the hill. It has been described by one former soldier as, quote, a massacre. There were too many people wounded, many dead, an avalanche of screaming. The 2nd Battalion commander, Colonel Betances Ramirez, a native Puerto Rican, ordered A Company to return to their positions, but many refused. Over 100 Borinqueneers would be arrested for desertion and insubordination. 96 of them were court-martialed and 91 of them were found guilty. Prison sentences ranged from 1 to 18 years of hard labor. It would be the largest mass court-martial of the Korean War. A few weeks later, another unit of white soldiers was ordered to retake Jackson Heights. Like the 65th, they were driven back, with many of them refusing to fight. None of them were court-martialed. The defeat at Jackson Heights was a black eye for the regiment that had served with such distinction. Soldiers wrote letters home to family about what happened. Newspapers began reporting about it. The New York Times wrote, "It was not the first time in war that troops had panicked under fire, but it was the first mass conviction by a court-martial for such action. It was also the first time in this war in which men from a unit which had won international recognition for bravery unexplainedly seemed to have changed their character under fire. The regiment fought in 9 major Korean campaigns, and its members had won 1,007 personal decorations, including 162 Silver Stars and 4 Distinguished Service Crosses. The 65th helped the Marines as a rear guard during the bitter Hungnam evacuation. It was the first regiment to re-enter Seoul in 1951, and it was instrumental in breaking the Iron Triangle during the summer of 1951." End quote. Years later, one veteran of the unit would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding off waves of enemy soldiers with his rifle and hand grenades on the night of April 28, 1951. By 1954, the convictions were overturned for the Borinqueneers, and they were given honorable discharges. On April 12, 2016, representatives of the remaining men who are still alive were presented with the Congressional Gold Medal. The Congressional Gold Medal is awarded by Congress as its, quote, highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievements and contributions, end quote, as explained on their website. President Obama said, quote, segregation set them apart from their fellow soldiers, but their courage made them legendary, end quote. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan said, quote, would you fight for a country who discriminated against you? It takes a certain caliber of man to do that, end quote. The story of the 65th Infantry Regiment will live on as proof of the bravery and sacrifice contributed by soldiers of Puerto Rico. Many people ask me, why did I tell this story? Why would I, a black woman, want to research and write about this for the past 10 years? Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Over 10 years ago, during Christmas Eve, with my husband's family, his grandfather showed me a medal. My husband was born and partially raised in Puerto Rico. My husband's grandfather explained to me that he was part of the famed 65th. I was actually ashamed that I never heard of the unit. I completed a prestigious high school, college, and graduate school, and never did I hear about the 65th Infantry Regiment in any history class that I took. On our drive home, I did what most people do when they want to know more about something. I Googled them. Most importantly, I wanted to find books about the unit for my kids to read so they knew more about this part of history that their great-grandfather was a part of. I could not find anything that was suitable for them to read. So my husband looked at me and said, well, I guess you have to write it. As an ally, my husband knew that I would tell the story honestly, represent the facts, and bring a spotlight or focus to a part of history that has lived far too long in the shadows. Allyship is an integral part of American history. If it is something big, like white people marching with Dr. Martin Luther King on Washington for racial equality in 1963, to smaller steps forward with Colonel Harris lifting the automatic court-martial for speaking Spanish, allies help push our country forward. No matter where we are born, what we look like, or where we were raised, is a responsibility of all of us to work and strive for a better country. That is it. Anyone have any questions?
No questions, but amazing job.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Awesome. I learned a lot.
Good.
Is there a place to find a listing of names of the soldiers that were in the figure?
Oh, yes. They're in the back of my book and all of the reference section. You can definitely go to a couple of websites and see our names. Yeah.
Of course, it will go without saying that they didn't reap any of the benefits of being in the service, like low-cost loans for housing, tuition-free, and all that other stuff.
Nor do they get their garnished wages back.
Yes, hello? No.
Yep. That's very true.
Was it Colonel Harris, the first leader who supported the Borinqueneers? What happened to that gentleman? I mean, he was transitioned out, and were there any? I always say like intercommunications with him, because he really galvanized a lot of folks. He showed respect, providing the culture to the Borinqueneers. And is there any information about him and how he ended his final years in the state?
Yeah, he went back. So he went back for a bit, and then he did some training. I think he was head of some training facilities and things like that for the military. I don't recall reading anything about more combat experience or more combats that he was in. But yeah, no, he was, and if anybody wants, adults, because it's sometimes a little graphic book, his memoir is great.
I just wanted to thank you for acknowledging Celestino. As being born and raised here in New Haven, Celestino's name and my family knew him very, very well. Always seeing him in his community service and everything like that. And we didn't know that he was part of the 65th until the acknowledgement. And then remember Rene Cordova, one of his nephews, mentioning at his funeral service how I believe that when the medals, some information came out and he talked about it with him, that kind of triggered that memory of that, and that started everything.
Yeah, he told me some very good stories, and also just some tough conditions that they were under. In the book, I also talk about some other experiences of prejudice and different things that the men experienced. But yeah, Celestino, he endured a lot in the war.
What was the age group for the enlistees?
Most of them were very young. To be honest, there are several that, because it was also, a lot of people went with family members, like brothers, cousins, and so, but they were generally 18 to 20. They were very, very young, the enlistees.
Was that the only regiment that was sent to Korea from Puerto Rico?
From Puerto Rico, yes. But what ended up happening is during rotation, so after Almond stayed with the unit and he saw how well run it was and how prepared the soldiers were that were going into the unit, he actually started before desegregation sending Puerto Rican soldiers to other units too, which also helped decrease some of their numbers. But he started to slowly, because in his memoir he also talks about how he was just vehemently opposed to segregation practices. So he started doing it in the military before it was fully embraced. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This is great.
Thank you.